Kavana if you know Hebrew. And the last thing we mentioned on Thursday and didn't explore is verse 22, which describes the upshot of having eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And there are a few comments that need to be made here which brush on the philosophical and also on the textual. Some translations read, "Behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." That translation would mean there's an us, there's some group, and we in the group know good and evil. And man didn't beforehand, and now has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Another translation, one which seems to be more precise, and it's the one that you have in this book, is that man has become like the unique one of us, knowing good and evil. Because in the Hebrew, it doesn't say echad, it says achad. Echad mimenu would mean one of us. Achad mimenu, achad is not the same as echad. Achad mimenu, achad means like unique, special, singled out. And that's the way the translation is written here. It's according to Rashi. And you notice that it's capitalized because it's God speaking, and he is the one who is unique among those who are above. So it would now not be plural. There are many who know, and he became like one of the plurality. It would be singular. Became like the one who knows, as opposed to the others who don't know. Either way, I'm quoting now Maimonides in the first chapter of the guide. It's a little hard to understand the picture. Maimonides says that a clever person once put to him the proposition that according to the book of Genesis, man is created essentially like an animal, not knowing good and evil. And then he violates a command of the Creator, and as a result gets the gigantic benefit, the gigantic gift, the gigantic superiority that now he knows good and evil, which no animal knows. Isn't it peculiar that, number one, he was created like an animal, and number two, that by violating the command, he becomes greatly superior. So Maimonides comes down on this guy hard. He says, you who are wasting your life and eating, drinking, and in free sexual activity, and you break off your orgy for a few minutes to glance into a book, things are not as they seem to you. And we would have to have an explanation as to why Rambam comes down so hard on this guy. And by the way, this is a thought that's echoed a dozen times in the Guide of the Perplexed, and it fits very well into 19th and 20th century Musar. If you're too deeply embedded in your physical desires, then you're not going to get to the truth. Well, Maimonides says, let's see. You picture them as having been created like animals, do you? What does it say in the first chapter? God said to the earth, bring forth animals. God said to the seas, bring forth animals. And then it says, let us make man with the tselem elukim, the tselem of God, tselem meaning some form of God, and a likeness to God. Doesn't say that about the squirrels, lions, cobras. Doesn't say about them. Only says it's like man, about man. So why would you think that he was created like an animal? I mean, are you reading the text? You're an intelligent person. You claim to have understanding. Did you understand those words? Did you remember those words? Pay attention to them? And furthermore, the Rambam says, what about the fact that God addresses commands to Adam? Doesn't command any animals. So that certainly makes him unlike the animals. And then let's push that a little bit. You address a command. To what kind of entity do you address commands? Do you address commands to stones? Do you address commands to snakes or to chinchillas? Why not? Because they have no clue what a command is. They have no clue what a command entails. You're talking to the wall. And even if you tell me you train your dog to obey your commands, all the dog knows is when those sounds occur and I do this, I get a hit. If I do that, I get a biscuit. That's all it knows. Doesn't know that good and evil, right and wrong. Doesn't make decisions. You address a command to a creature, that creature must understand what commanding is and what the consequences are. You address a command to a creature which is making its own decisions, and you want to affect those decisions. And you affect the decisions by issuing the command and explaining and communicating thereby. One who's getting the command has an interest in what you do and is going to respond to what you do. So how could you have thought that they're being created like animals? That's just any 10-year-old looking at the text could see that that's not true. And you're not 10 years old. You're an adult, and you claim to be intellectual, so something's corrupting your intellect. And in your case, what's corrupting your intellect is your utter attachment to the world in physical terms, particularly your physical pleasures. That's why he jumps on him. Because the mistakes that he's making are unbelievable mistakes for someone who's reading the text, taking it seriously, and trying to give an intelligent remark about it. Even a critical remark. But it's not a smart criticism. It's a dumb criticism. Okay, but then the Rambam says, if so, how do we understand Adam's relationship to the command? If he didn't know good and evil, what then enabled him to respond to the command and to the dynamics of the command? That there are consequences to what you do, what you don't do. And the Rambam, now this is the Rambam talking, I don't know if others agree with him. I also don't know if they disagree with him. This is something that he says. It's a famous book, and it's worthwhile understanding it on its own. He says that they had two concepts with which they understood the world and understood interactions, which are different from good and evil, but which played a similar role, and which enabled him to respond to a command correctly, but in other terms. Meaning, he has these other concepts, and with these other concepts, he can understand that acting one way will have certain consequences, acting another way will have other consequences, and there are preferences in the way that you act, more appropriate ways and less appropriate ways, even though they aren't the concepts of good and evil. Now, he wrote the book in Arabic. In this place, he uses two Hebrew words, Emet and Sheker. You look in the dictionary, Emet is defined as true or truth, and Sheker is defined as false or falsehood. But, as Rav Dessler points out, the translation is not correct, and it's certainly not going to do the job here, because we're picturing a person being ordered to do something and evaluating what to do. And these two concepts are supposed to enable him to make the decision what to do and understand what the consequences are. And actions aren't true and false. Actions could be good and bad, productive or destructive, wise or unwise, but true and false aren't words that we use for actions. And indeed, the first place where the word emes appears in the Torah is where it describes an action. It's, will you do emes? Emes is something you do. So translating it as true is going to be off base, even though what it does mean may overlap with true, but doesn't say the same thing. Emes in Hebrew, according to Rav Dessler, and if you look through a concordance, you know what a concordance is? It's a book that has every word in the entire Tanakh with every place where it occurs. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then for a word like ish, or Ella, it'll have like little pieces of the phrase in which it occurs, so you can see all the places where it occurs in the Tanakh. You can compare them back and forth. And the old style one that wasn't done with computers, you would have a word that has a certain grammatical root, and you would have all of the associated words in the same place. So the poor computer does it by spelling, and therefore it makes mistakes. And emes is very often used to describe action. So, roughly, emes means something which is eternal. What it does lasts. It portrays the world in a way that's accurate to the world. It doesn't create an illusion, like magicians create illusions. So it leads you to false beliefs. It's something which, the Sheker is something which is temporary, which falls over eventually. And actions can have those qualities. So when Adam gets his command, he knows doing what the Creator commands will have this eternal, absolute quality to it, and violating what he commands will have this ephemeral, misleading, and collapsing aspect to it, and he knows what is preferable to do. Says Maimonides, when they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they lose those original concepts, and they're replaced by other concepts that are confused and limited. They don't take into account the entirety of the context, past, present, and future, and therefore they are very inferior concepts with which to guide your life and to explore what you're doing. And he says that it's not possible to have both concepts together. It's not possible to think and to react in terms of both concepts together. You either have one or the other. You can't have both. So I'll give you an example of what I think this is like. Imagine a person you meet who's never seen a video, has never been to a theater where they show moving pictures. Never seen it. Wow. You know, he comes from the interior of Australia, the hinterlands of Australia. He said, wow, well, I've got something to show you. I mean, this is really something terrific. You shouldn't miss this. So you take him to a moving picture in a theater, which is already in the middle. And as you walk into the theater where you can see the screen, the scene is a herd of wild horses charging towards the camera. So he walks in, he looks up, he hears the sound, he says, "Oh my God, get out of the way! We're going to die!" Because they're charging right at the camera. So you say to him, "No, don't worry. Don't worry, are you crazy? In 10 seconds, we're dead." So listen, it's only a picture. Well, I don't know what you mean. There are horses coming at us. Well, he can't listen to you because he sees horses coming at him. On the other hand, you can't share his fear because you know it's only a picture. You can't have in your mind simultaneously that it's only a picture and be frightened out and want to run. You either look at it one way or the other way. There's no way of putting the two of them together. Emet and Sheker, from Kodesh Baruch Hu's point of view, means the place of this action in the totality of the creation and in the totality of history, past, present, and future. And also, not from an idiosyncratic, limited, subjective point of view. That's what Emet and Sheker portray. Good and evil are relative, they're limited, and they project a certain human subjective attitude towards things which distorts their real value and their real nature. So, for example, a great deal of what's called morality or ethics deals with the problem of suffering. And it is taken for granted at the outset that suffering is an evil. and that if one is undergoing suffering, then something's wrong, and if you could relieve the suffering, you ought to, and someone who causes suffering, that's automatically bad. And a great deal of ethical thought is about the impact and the responsibilities we have vis-a-vis people suffering. But if you ask, what exactly is bad about suffering? Is it the experience itself or its impact on the person? If he's suffering, he can't do other things that are good, maybe? Or he becomes depressed, and it's the depression that's bad, not the suffering that's bad? It's not obvious what the answers are to those questions. And if you thought that the suffering was a necessary part in a gigantic good, your condemnation of suffering would be very, very much reduced. Let me give you just a little example where this applies in part. People play football. There's pain in football. If you're playing serious football, there's pain. Did you ever hear somebody say, you know, sometimes we get banged up, and there is pain, and that's bad. And I am suffering when I play football, but it's worth it because you get the thrill of winning the game or playing the game. I never heard anybody complain about the pain of football. When you're involved in the game, yeah, it's painful, right? But your focus is on something else, and you don't pay much attention to it. About 130 years ago, when I did some sports in high school and college, I ran cross country, which is 2.5 mile race, and I ran the 440, and I was on the wrestling team. There's pain involved there, no question about it, but somehow you don't even think about it. You think of someone learning ethics and saying, these people are suffering, they have bad lives because they're in pain, and so forth and so on. I know what I could do. I could disband the sports teams in the school, and then you wouldn't have all that pain. Wouldn't your life be better off? That sounds crazy. It just sounds crazy. So maybe this taking for granted that pain is the evil, the supreme evil, and so forth and so on, and maybe it expresses a certain point of view which isn't necessary. Maybe there's another point of view. When you hear that, you think, well, so what am I doing exactly? Why am I thinking this way? You begin to feel, well, maybe this isn't the only way to think. Maybe if you looked at the world from a Kadosh Baruch Hu's point of view, the pain in the human existence would be like the horses on the screen. Yeah, you see horses, but they aren't real horses. And the pain isn't real evil. So this was a gigantic step down, according to Maimonides. And that meant that what the critics said, that they got a tremendous benefit. On the contrary, they didn't get a benefit, they got punished for the crime that they committed. That's how Maimonides answers the critic, and it's how you have some perspective on what it means here when it's talking about this. This is just an introduction. That point is okay? Yeah.
So, Adam, after,
See, I only did half of it now. I only talked about knowing good and evil. I didn't answer the question about what it means to be like one of us or so on.
So, but when it says like knowing, when it says the way, okay, sorry, we didn't get up to that part, but the tree of life, like.
Okay, let's leave that. We're doing the tree of knowledge of good and evil right now. That's a separate issue. Now, there's another thing here. The way the translation goes, the translation that you have in the text, which I mentioned, is okay. It's definitely an okay translation. But Maimonides doesn't take it that way. He punctuates the verse differently and gets an entirely different meaning out of it. He reads it as, behold, man has become unique, comma. Not the unique one among us, but unique. Hein ha'adam haya kachad. And then the next phrase, mimenu ladas tov v'ra, means he knows good and evil from himself. He has an internal grasp on good and evil. Mimenu in Hebrew can be from himself, or Mimenu can be like one of us, among us. It's the same word in Hebrew, but it has two different meanings. And Maimonides says human beings have knowledge of good and evil internal to them. They're created with a certain knowledge of good and evil, which is a radical proposition, though here others do agree with him, that you don't have to learn what's good and evil by being taught it from an external source, at least in some extent. I'm going to qualify this in a moment. But there is a grasp on good and evil which doesn't come from an external source. Which means, as he says in the guide, you could know that something's a good and evil without being told, not even being told by the Torah. Now, here we have to be a little careful. When you decide that a particular item is good or evil, let's say an action is good or evil, you're building your judgment on two pillars. One pillar is the facts about the action. What will its consequences be? What are its relationships, so on and so on. And the other is your moral principles. You need both of them in order to decide whether it's good or evil. And people can disagree sometimes just based on the facts. Sometimes people change their minds because they got the facts wrong. None of this is what we're talking about. When the Torah says that people know what's good and evil, it means certain principles of good and evil. But that won't necessarily apply to the facts of a particular situation because they might not have the facts right. Here are a few examples. Up to about 200 years ago, when a person had a fever, a doctor would bleed him, either with leeches or with suction cups, cause him to bleed. Because what was taught from ancient times is that when a person has a fever, he's got too much blood. And if you relieve some of the blood, you'll help combat the injury and the fever. We don't do that anymore. Can you guess why? Because it's really not good for you, actually. It will not help your fevers at all. It might even hurt. So now, what happened? When they did it, the doctors 200 years ago, they believed it was good. Now we believe it's bad. What changed? Not our principles. We still think that doctors have a responsibility for people's health. And all the doctors, before and afterwards, were faithful doctors acting in order to promote people's health. It's just that the knowledge of the facts turned out to be incorrect. You have arguments about different aspects of economics, political arguments, which are based sometimes on moral principles. Should there be a minimum wage law or shouldn't there be a minimum wage law? The difference here is not one party is sympathetic to the problems of the poor and the other party says, let the poor sink, I don't care. That's not the argument. The argument is that by having a minimum wage law, you hurt the poor. You don't help them. They're worse off that way. Now, that might be true, might be false, but the argument here isn't a moral argument. Everybody agrees that something should be done for the poor and you should do the best that you can. The question is whether having a minimum wage really helps them or it doesn't help them. So a lot of the moral judgments we make are based on our grasp of the circumstances. That's not what the Torah is talking about. It's talking about the basic principles of morality. And I think, contrary to the sociology and anthropology and popular philosophy of 30 and 40 years ago, there's a lot of emphasis now on the universality of concepts in different human cultures and at different times, not the variations in the cultures. I think there's a good case to be made for a bedrock of commonly understood aspects of morality. And then the arguments and disagreements are very often questions of the associated facts. One last remark, and then I'll take the questions about that. One big fact, which will have a big effect on what you think is good and evil, is the fact of their being a creator who issued commands. That's a big fact. There is a creator, and he isn't a deistic creator who created the world and went on vacation, but he's actually involved in running the world so that there's a relationship between the world and the creator, and we as human beings with the creator. Then the commands that he gives is going to make a big difference about what we judge to be good and bad. Not because he's teaching us morality, not because of that, but because our morality tells us that if there's a creator and he's running the world and providing you with everything that you have, that affects what really is good to do and what really is bad to do. Sometimes I try this with people who don't have much Jewish background. And I say, I don't know if you believe this or not, but use your imagination. You're standing in the wilderness, in the desert, you and 3 million other people. You're standing at a mountain, and you all simultaneously hear a voice from the heavens coming from the Creator saying, Saturdays are special. Don't do various things on Saturdays. Suppose that happened to you. Would that change your plans for the weekend? Would you take it into account? Would you think it was important? Or would you say, yeah, I know that's what he wants, but I have a scuba diving date. I can't give that up. Would it make any difference at all? I've not yet met a person who said, yeah, if I heard that, no, I wouldn't take account of it. Wouldn't make any difference. I wouldn't have any effect on my plans. Why not? Because, well, there's a creator, and he cares about this. That's a very important fact to take into account morally. So that's what we're talking about. The basic moral principles are something that are internal to the human constitution, which means that sometimes when there's a discussion about what's right and what's wrong, and somebody says, prove it, or justify it, or argue for it, or so and so on, sometimes it's appropriate to say, it's just obvious. Anyone whose mind is working correctly can see that. I don't have to prove it. And the comparison that's made in philosophy by philosophers whom I respect is a comparison with mathematics. You're providing something, and you say, well, I got 7 of these, so 7 5 is 12. And then somebody says, what? 7 plus 5 is 12. How do you know? Prove it. Tell me where you got it from. Who said so? I think you'd say, stop wasting my time. You don't know that 7 plus 5 is 12? You can't see that? Well, you have trouble. And remind me not to hire you for any job that requires any understanding of the world. Right? There's some things that are just obvious. Where in your holy books does it say 7 plus 5 is 12? I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be in the holy books. God created us with a mind that grasps this by itself, without it being in the holy books. Is it separated from God? No, he created my mind that way. It's not separated from him. But it doesn't. He created my mind in such a way that I know it by thinking about it, by investigating it on my own. I don't have to do any more than that. And morality, the basics of morality are like that. Yeah, question.
So after the sin and the whole world, everything changes, and we said that from the curse to Adam, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to sweat and work like how we do it. But was it to him? Would he ever have been able to overcome that part, even if he repented or did anything, or was that curse specific to him? Would it have been?
Well, that's an interesting question. We know the curse was reversed in the times of Noah. But what about the fact that Hevel, very early on, became he was working with animals. He wasn't working as a farmer at all. He didn't work as a farmer at all. So, to say that you're going to be a poor, unproductive farmer, thorns and thistles shall the earth bring forth when you plant seed. He's not planting seed. He's not getting thorns and thistles. He's working with animals. So, certainly that part of the curse didn't have to come true. Doesn't mean that every human being is going to have to be a poor, unsuccessful farmer.
So could he have like the main thing is like, could he have made it back to the Garden of Eden?
No. That we'll see. There's the very last verse of this page, this chapter, says that God sealed the Garden of Eden while alive, and until we go through the period of resurrection, it's not going to happen. Yeah, I say your question. You got a question? No.
You answered my question.
Okay. So that's some thoughts about this. Then it says, in the same verse, 22, he's now in this position. Now, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life and eat it and live forever. So now, since he ate from the tree of knowledge, now he has to be prevented from eating from the tree of life. That seems to imply that had he not eaten from the tree of knowledge, there would have been nothing preventing him from eating from the tree of life. This is the idea that by him eating from the tree of knowledge, death came into the world. Man was not created to die. It was by his own action that he brought that, and he was told that the day on which you eat from the tree, you will become mortal. And this is an answer to a set of questions which, on the one hand, is obvious, but until I received an email from Jonathan Ostroff in Toronto, who used to be a Talmud of mine, I don't think I focused on it appropriately. Our world has all sorts of evils in it. Death for sure, illness, injury, disabilities, the results of victimization, and so on and so on. Not to mention the need to put in considerable effort to just stay alive. Why did God create a world with so much evil in it? So much suffering, so much destruction in it? Why did he create such a world? The straight answer to that question is he didn't. God created the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, there was no injury, and there was no death, and there was no illness, and there were no disabilities, and so on and so on. All of that is a result of disobeying the command that he gave us. If you hadn't disobeyed that command, none of those things would have come into existence. You could push the question further and say, okay, but why did he set up such a world which, if you perform this transgression, this will be the result? Okay, you could ask that question, but it doesn't have the punch of the previous question. The punch of the previous question is, he just made evil, period. No, he didn't. He just made good. He made a world in which disobedience is followed by evil. That's not the same thing at all. Just making evil sounds unjust. Punishing crime doesn't sound obviously unjust. Something that would have to be argued out in other terms. Now, as he mentioned, and I want to just expatiate on it a little bit, it's not just that they ate from the tree and they suffered a kind of deterioration, a degradation. The whole of the universe was pulled down a notch. So, I'm quoting the Ramchal now. If you would imagine the world distinguished into physical and spiritual, and that was so even the original creation, but when they ate from the tree of knowledge, so then their physical, which is the lower level, became the new higher level. Below that level of their physical, a new level of physical was created, which is much more materialistic, much more distant from the spiritual. And their spiritual level, which is the original top level, is out of reach. So the whole of the creation came down a giant step. And then the question is, so where are we now? And what's the status of where we are now? And the status is this, that something can be done even in the lower world to form a relationship with the previous existence. You can't get back to it. You can't get back to the Garden of Eden. But you can be, in the lower world, a representative of that higher thing. That's what Abraham did. Abraham achieved a relationship with that spirituality which stepped him up to that relationship. And according to Ramchal, anyone could have done it. And everyone could have done it. It wasn't just one person who could do it. It could have been the totality of the population. Could have molded themselves in such a way as to have that relationship. The purpose of that is that while in this world, to build one's spirituality to the extent that this world will allow, and then that will be in place of passing the test in the Garden of Eden. It'll be in place of that. And then what passing the test of the Garden of Eden would have accomplished will be accomplished here. It's the same accomplishment has to be achieved, but in a different way and in a different context. And that means that there's got to be a systematic relationship between what the accomplishment would have been in the world, in the Garden of Eden, and what the accomplishment is here. Rav Dessler has a whole essay on that, which, as I've come so far, I'll share with you, and then you'll have a picture where we are and what we're doing in our world. Rav Dessler is basing himself on certain midrashim. Because Baruch said to Adam, "Don't eat from the tree." Adam understood himself correctly, that he was created in such a way that he couldn't do a deliberate transgression. He couldn't simply say, "Yeah, I know what you said, but I'm going elsewhere. I'm doing something else." We can do that. Even prophets can do that. Jonah did that. God said to Jonah, go to Nineveh. And he said, "No, I'm going to Tarshish." We can rebel. Adam couldn't rebel. The only mistake Adam was capable of was to rationalize to himself that what he wants to do is correct. That he could do. The question is, where did the rationalization come from? So here's Adam's rationalization. If God tells me not to eat from the tree, and I don't eat from the tree, I'm just being who I am. I can't rebel, so I'm not rebelling. And so, isn't it kind of trivial? Is it really different from being a squirrel? I'm just doing what my divinely created nature has me do. Wouldn't it be much more spectacular spiritually if I were to eat from the tree and come to know good and evil in such a way that I would be able to rebel, and then follow God's command thereafter, consistently, fighting down the urge to rebel? Wouldn't that be a much greater achievement? So, the natural response to that thought is, so what? God said don't do it. What do you mean it'll be a greater achievement? What's it got to do with following or not following God's command? But Adam has an answer for that. Because in Jewish law, there's something called a Horos Shah. Horos Shah means a teaching, a temporary teaching. And Horos Shah gives to the court, and in certain circumstances to the prophet, the authority to tell you to violate a divine command. It's built into the system that there is an authority to violate a divine command. Can you start a war on Shabbos? Yeah, you can. In Shabbos you can't make fires and so forth and so on, but you can. If you need to, you can. And I'm not talking about a defensive war where it's life and death. That for sure you can do. But there are times when you can be told to start an offensive war, because the court has that authority. So Adam says, I'm using Torah principles now. Yes, God said not to eat from the tree. And yes, God also said that there's such a thing as a temporary decree. And I think I have a good reason to make a temporary decree and eat from it once. Indeed, that's the way the idea of a temporary decree is described. Creating a greater sanctification of God's name in the world justifies the court saying to do something which violates the law, violates the Torah law. So that's how we justified it. Okay, so coming that far, Rabbi Zessa says, so what went wrong? Where's the mistake? The mistake, there's a basic element of introspection. The principle he said a moment ago was that you can break the law to have a greater sanctification of God's name. Well, was that his motivation? There are two ways to read his motivation. Let's put his motivation into a sentence. My obedience to the command will be trivial. Where's the emphasis? Is it my obedience to the command will be trivial? The obedience to the command, which is acting out God's will in the world. It's the contribution to the sanctity of the world. That obedience will be trivial because it's just based on my nature. That's one way to read it. That would justify his conclusion. But there's another way to read it, and that is my obedience to the command will be trivial, meaning I will be trivial. I will have accomplished nothing. I'll be a nobody. I'll be a zero. What was he really worried about? That the event in the world standing to sanctify God's name will be trivial? Or was he worrying about the fact that he will be trivial? He will be nothing. And says Rav Dessler, really he was worried about his triviality. That's what really motivated him. And since he wasn't motivated to create a greater sanctification of God's name, your being trivial or not being trivial isn't the justification for violating the command. That's not a reason to violate a law, because you'll be something or you won't be something. This was the test. And this is a very striking test. It means you have to give up your status in spirituality. You have to give up your status in accomplishing for a Kodesh Baruch Hu. This is not, gosh, cheeseburgers. I have to give up cheese. How am I supposed to do that? I mean, how could anybody demand of me to give up cheeseburgers? No, it's not like that. Giving up scuba diving on Shabbos. These are pleasures for myself. No, this means giving up, doing something for God. Yeah. And sometimes you have to do that. You have to give it up because that's not what God wants. So he had to face the fact of his own triviality and accept it and say, if that's what God wants, then that's what needs to be done. And that's what he failed at. And in a certain sense, we have that test throughout the subsequent history in terms of how God creates and runs the world. I'll give you first a concrete example, and then I'll say it in general terms, and then I'll be finished. Moses sent spies to spy out the land. They came back with a terrible report, and the result of it was the people rebelled, and they didn't want to go and conquer the land. They had to spend 40 more years in the desert, and the spies were killed on the spot. By a divine fire, they were killed on the spot. Why did that happen? So there's a midrash that says, these spies, as the Torah tells us, were the leaders of their tribes, and they knew that when they went into the land of Israel, they wouldn't be leaders of the tribes anymore. Now, they weren't leaders of the tribes amassing slush funds of money and betting on, investing in AT&T and betting on horse races and so forth and so on. They were the leaders of the spirituality of their tribes. But to go into the land of Israel as non-leaders, to go in as ordinary citizens, that's something they couldn't face. They couldn't face it. And because they couldn't face it, because their own spiritual self-importance was too central to them, they didn't have the ability to resist the temptations that were incorporated into the spying. Joshua also sent spies, 2 spies, and they came in and they spied out the land, and then the local armies were on their track, and the only place that they could find refuge was in the house of a zona. Now, the word zona has two different meanings. Some commentators say it means she ran an inn. Zan is to nourish. It means providing nourishment, provided, food and board. But others say that she was a prostitute. What are the holy agents of the Jewish people doing in the house of a prostitute? Well, they were sent to spy out the land. And the only way they're going to succeed is to do this. So they did it, meaning their purity and their spirituality and the context, they have a job to do. And they're willing to give up on their own to be able to do the job. That's why they were protected. Because their own importance didn't stand in their way. We have a saying in the Talmud, a chassid shota, a chassid is supposed to be a very pious person who's insane. And here's what's happening. A woman is drowning, and it's a question of saving her. And he says, how am I going to save her without looking at her? I can't look at a woman, so let her drown. No, wrong answer, sorry. As the Hasidim put it, you can't pull someone out of the mud without getting dirty. So if you're hyper about not getting dirty, then you can't save someone from the mud. And it can be a mitzvah to save someone from the mud. You have to be willing to sacrifice your own spirituality. Now, where does that apply to us in general terms? Well, we live in a world that looks like the world has a nature that causes it to behave in certain ways all by itself. The laws of nature seem to be completely automatic, completely autonomous. Nothing's manipulating them or causing them. Stone, if you let go of the stone, it falls. And if you light a fire, it darts upward. That's the way the world is. And because the world is a place of nature, if I'm very clever and I work very hard and I study nature very well, I could do well. I could make a killing. And then when I study and put in the time and effort and the money comes rolling in, I made a killing. But of course you didn't. Of course, it's all a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But here's where the ego wants to take over and say that I did it, so I'm somebody. Here it's on a materialistic level, as opposed to Adam's challenge where it wasn't materialistic, it was spiritual. But it's the I'm somebody syndrome. And here again, it's also an expression of Sheker, something that's a lie. Because I didn't do it on my own. Had HaKadosh Baruch Hu not given me the results wouldn't have been there. I made the effort, that's true. But the results certainly weren't under my control. So here is the temptation to the same type of test, the I. Only Adam's was in the Garden of Eden, and we're in this world. Adam's was in spirituality. For us, largely, it's physicality, but still, it's the same test. And it's set up as a test, because we have to be conquering that which Adam failed at, conquering it piecemeal and conquering it only in degrees, but we're conquering the same thing. That gives us a very interesting picture of the nature of our world as a continuation of the experience of Adam, those who were with him, in the Garden of Eden, and how it's a continuation and a kapara, an atonement for that. Yeah.
What's the difference between sacrificing spirituality and just embracing physicality? Or embracing physicality? Because it seems like sacrificing spirituality.
Well, I don't think that when Adam was afraid of being a spiritual nothing, and he acted in order to become a spiritual something, I wouldn't call that embracing physicality. He wasn't going out for milkshakes. Right? He wasn't going out for scuba diving in the Red Sea. He wanted to have a strong spiritual contribution. So I wouldn't call that embracing physicality. The ego isn't necessarily, well, okay, there are different views about it. Maybe using the word ego is importing an English concept. But not every inability to accept there being nothing of yourself, I think would be called physical. By the way, the one person who achieved overcoming this problem and overcoming this test, passing this test in the most superb fashion, was Moses. The the rabbinic literature describes Moses as the Shekhinah, God's presence, spoke from his mouth. Usually, if I tell someone to give a message to somebody else, so he's got to take the message. Sometimes he paraphrases his own mind. He uses his own intonation in giving the message. Right? It's going through him, and part of what the recipient gets is the messenger's contribution. In Moses' case, there wasn't any messenger. It was a direct divine expression through him. That's where you make yourself really into nothing. Yeah.
So what was the point then in keeping the Garden of Eden around? If we messed up there and we can't do our mission there and we have to do our mission here, what's the point of Garden of Eden?
So, although there are different explanations for this sort of thing, but after death it can be used for souls. In the meantime.
Yeah, but I mean, that wasn't the point of what it was. It that the point of what it was.
But that's not what you asked. That's not what you asked. What you asked was, if it's not serving the purpose that it was originally created for, what's the point of keeping it around? And the answer is, it serves another purpose. Right? Talk to people who believe in evolution, where they co-opt one thing and it does something else. Okay, so that's the way around it. And then this idea of living forever, what would be wrong with living forever? Why was man created in such a way as to not live forever? And what would be the failure in enabling to live forever? And the answer to that, says the Ramchal, is the following. The purpose of the job in the Garden of Eden was to pass this spiritual test. Passing this spiritual test would have a double effect. Number one, the soul, which directs the actions of the person, would thereby realize its potential for raising itself. And then the soul could operate on the body so as to purify the body and spiritualize the body to the extent where, instead of being at odds with the soul, it could be, number one, at peace with the soul, and number two, become a partner with the soul in the soul's project as a soul. All that could have happened. If that had happened, then this body, the soul, and the transformed body together as a unit would be ready to go into the world to come. That was the plan. Now, when the world took a gigantic step down, one thing that happened is the human body became much more materialized. And materialized carries as an implication much more divorced from the spiritual. And now, if the person makes right decisions and perform mitzvos, and that definitely enables the soul to realize its capacity to be spiritual. But if the soul is going to apply its spirituality to the body's going to burn up. It's like plugging a 110 appliance into a wall here, into a 220 volt electricity source, and it just burns up. So the present body can't take the transformation that was supposed to have happened. So the way to repair the situation is the person dies. What does the person die mean? It means that the body no longer functions, and therefore the soul can't interact with the body and function as a unit together with the body. So they separate, and the body then deteriorates. Resurrection means a recreation of a body, but in a different form. In a form similar to the form that Adam had. In a form that could take the spirituality of the soul. Spirituality of the soul applied to that body would purify it and spiritualize it and elevate it so that it could become a partner with the soul and then thereby go to the world to come. So the death and resurrection become now necessary parts in this process of overcoming the degradation of the world that was a result of the crime in the Garden of Eden. That's what's going on now instead of it. That's why death is so important. So God says, I'm not depriving the world of the tree of of life. But you in your present condition, if you eat from the tree of life, you're going to be sunk. Because there's no way to spiritualize the body, in which case there's no way to get into the world to come. And the whole purpose of the creation was to get into the world to come. So, the end of the story is this. We're back again in 1922. We just finished this verse, so to speak. So, it says, "23." I don't think the translation is good here. God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the soil from which he was taken. Where's that come from? That comes from the curse. Not here. Page back. When he ate from the tree, God said you're going to be cursed. One of the things you're going to do is you're going to become a poor, unsuccessful farmer. Thorns and thistles. That's not going to happen in the Garden of Eden. So he expels him from the Garden of Eden because of that. And then it says, and I don't know why your translator translate this way, and he drove out the man, and he stationed at the east of the garden of the Kruvim, the flame, the everlasting, to guard the way to the tree of life. In other words, my oldest son pointed out to me, there are two different desiderata being accomplished by his leaving the garden. One is that he was cursed for eating the tree, and the curse was you'll be a poor, unsuccessful farmer, and that's not going to happen in the Garden of Eden. That's one reason he was chased out. And the other is that he shouldn't eat from the tree of life. For the tree of life, he set up guardians to make sure that he doesn't go back. Because after all, even if he's living in Akko, or he's living in Tiberia, and he's working the soil and having a tough time of it, that doesn't mean he couldn't visit there for 6 hours once every 3 months. That wouldn't contradict the curse of having to work the land and get thorns and thistles. So one is that he was expelled in order to make him work the land, and the other is that he was prevented from even ever going back temporarily so as not to be able to eat from the tree of life. Two different things are going on here simultaneously. And they're two separate verbs. Ba'ashalchehu, what do they translate? They say banished. Really, the verb in 24 is more like banished. Ligaresh means to gerish in his divorce. He divorced him from it. He cut him off from it. That's because he put the guardians there, so he can't come back. The other is like sending him out. Sending him out is not the same as putting a barrier so that you can't get back. And both of these things are true. And that, so to speak, sets up our world. Yeah? Okay, this is very, very deep material, and I'm just scratching the surface, and sometimes you have to hear something multiple times to get used to it. With Torah, that's very, very common. And as you go along, you correct misimpressions that you had before, but there's no hope for it. And lahavdil, the same would be true in any difficult subject. When you start a new difficult subject with concepts that you're not familiar with, when you first hear them, you'll draw conclusions and make associations, and then later you'll learn that the associations have to be upgraded. That's certainly true with Torah study. Okay?
Thank you, Rabbi.